Hello, and welcome back to the 2022 Georgetown Women's Forum virtual series. I'm Stephanie Seitz, the Senior Director of Alumni Affinity and Alliance Engagement here at Georgetown, and I will be helping facilitate today's session. The Georgetown University Women's Forum celebrates Georgetown women from each of the 9 schools and provides an opportunity for Georgetown alumni from across the country and abroad to share experiences, ideas, and expertise around women and gender issues. Today's latest session is the power of storytelling, and we are so excited to see so many of you joining us virtually this afternoon. Thank you for taking time out of your day to be here. Before we dive in, I just want to share a few housekeeping notes and introduce our panelists. This conversation is being recorded, and the recording will be made available on our YouTube channel, and you will receive the recording in a follow-up email. We have a very exciting discussion planned for you today, but if questions are welcome for our speakers. Please feel free to submit those questions using the Q&A feature on the Zoom webinar menu. Now I want to take a moment to introduce today's speakers. Maureen Corrigan, a book critic for NPR's Fresh Air, and the Nikki Jamie Grant Distinguished Professor of the Practice in Literary Criticism in the Department of English here at Georgetown. Aminata Forna, an award-winning author of novels Happiness, The Hired Man, the memoir The Devil That Danced on the Water, and the essay collection, The Window Seat, Notes from a Life in Motion. She is also the director of the Landon Center here at Georgetown. Thank you so much to all of you for being here today with us. Without further ado, I'm excited to go ahead and turn things over to Maureen to kick things off.
Thank you, Stephanie. Hi, Aminata.
Hi, Maureen. How are you?
We actually are next door neighbors on the 4th floor of New North, so it's a little odd for us to be having the conversation this way, but I'm happy to have the conversation in any form. So I wanted to start by talking about the window seat, and I wanted to talk a bit about, I don't know, the overriding image that first essay introduces, the title essay, which is you on a plane. And apparently, as you tell us, you love air travel, which I think puts you in a minority these days, but there you are. And I was struck by the image that you presented of looking out the window and I think flying over the desert in the US. And these kind of, I mean, I've seen them too, these configurations, you almost think that they're crop circles that appear sometimes, and you wonder, what is this? And it made me think of the fact that sometimes we don't see patterns until we're at a distance. And I know you and I have talked a bit about the stories that have informed our life. And so I wanted to try to connect the dots between that image of you in the plane, discerning patterns at a distance, and make a leap and ask you about the patterns that you've discerned at this point in your life in terms of stories that have informed you, either the stories you've read or you heard as a child, that helped you become you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Stephanie, for that introduction, and welcome to everybody. So pleased to be taking part in this conversation. I do love air travel. I mean, I must say that that domestic American flights have probably done more to put me off air travel than almost anything else, because I'm used to traveling internationally. But nevertheless, I will say this, and I've taken thousands of flights in my life. I grew up in different countries. My father from Sierra Leone, my mother from Scotland, going to boarding school in Britain, but also my stepfather was a diplomat for the United Nations. So I grew up in all kinds of places, and air travel was something that I curiously have never taken for granted. Actually, when I get on an airplane, I don't turn on the screen in front of me. I look out of the window, and I can spend an 8-hour, 9-hour flight just looking out of the window. I find it so astonishing, particularly because actually one day we may never be able to do that. It just seems to me this is a moment in human history where we can actually do something that generations before never saw, and generations into the future might never see. So people talk about that 30,000-foot view, don't they? It's a sort of favorite analogy now in the business world. They say, well, let me give you the 30,000-foot view. But I think it's a lens I've had on the world for quite a long time because of the way that I've grown up. I've always been able to look at one place from another place. And so when we think, and I think that's informed my storytelling hugely, is to be able to look at almost everything from both the outside and the inside, but also to bring this specifically to your question, to see those patterns. There's a wonderful way that some people approach introductions. Sometimes people will say, where are you from? Which I always find almost impossible to answer, or at least too complicated. Yeah. But somebody said to me a few years ago, what's your story? Hello, he said, what's your story? And I thought that is such a good way of inviting someone to talk about themselves. And I think that the stories that started to build me at the very beginning, and which probably inform my approach, my Scottish family, or my Scottish grandmother always told these stories about fairies, spelled Faeries, which were not like the other kind of fairy with an AI, because Scottish fairies are very whimsical and very badly behaved, and they did terrible things. I mean, it depended on how you treated them. You had to always appease them, and you had to leave things out for them. Leave out a saucer of milk, leave out a little bit of this or a little bit of that. Otherwise, they would start to disrupt your household. And they could be quite chaotic. I mean, what Scottish fairies did was they actually switched babies at birth. So there was this thing called a changeling. And my grandfather used to tease me and call me a changeling, which is probably a terrible thing to do. But anyway, I took it as it was intended. But it was like when they would put a little fairy baby down and they'd take the human baby away. And they often kidnapped people. And they did terrible, shocking, but also mischievous things. And they generally had to be treated with caution and respect. And my Scottish family, my clan in Scotland is the Farquharsons. And my grandmother Duncan, actually, who were the, Macbeth's, opposition, but my grandfather was a Farquharson. Now, when I start to look at my Sierra Leonean family, what do I see? I see that they have an almost identical form of storytelling, right? They have these little things which are called spirits, which was translated as devils into English, but they're really like little sprites. They're almost exactly the same as the Scottish fairies. They do exactly the same things. They cross between worlds. They can do you favors, or they can upset you, upset your life if you do things, if you cross them. One of the most famous ones is one called Mami Wata, and she is a female spirit, and she lives in water. And if you see Mami Wata, it means that you will be rich for the rest of your life. She will bring you great wealth, but she will never have children. And again, if I think about my Sierra Leonean family, I think about the fact that we had a tribe, not a clan. Well, it was Timni, but it worked in exactly the same way. And if I think about my two grandparents or my grandfathers, I didn't know my Sierra Leonean grandmother, but if I think about my grandfathers, I see two men who are almost identical, right? One is Black and lives in West Africa, one is white and lives in the north of Scotland, but they are both highly religious. One is Muslim, one is Scottish Presbyterian. They are both authoritarian, they are both patriarchal, they are both very disciplined in their cells. They didn't eat much, they took care of themselves, they didn't drink. So they were actually terribly similar. And these are the things I think that when you have that 30,000 foot view, you can see that the question I'm always asked is, oh, you come from two such different cultures. but I don't see the difference. I see the similarities.
You know, it's interesting hearing you talk and emphasizing the similarities, because I could see that kind of emphasis objected to. You know, for instance, if I were to emphasize the similarities, I could see people saying, well, wait a minute, you're not respecting the difference enough. You're trying to flatten everything out. You're trying to, you know, not pay enough respect to the distinctions between people. I think, you know, these days, I feel like, especially in literary criticism, we're more aware, and maybe by we, I mean white critics, that we really can't and shouldn't try to make everything like us. So I'm sort of...
Well, there's sort of countervailing trends, aren't they? I mean, it does feel at the moment like everyone's just looking for an argument about anything, to be honest. Yeah. But, you know, there are countervailing trends whereby the idea of universality, which was that seemed to be an impetus of fiction in decades gone by, has been replaced by an idea of writing, of authenticity, that we are writing from some kind of specific experience. I mean, you know, I'm going to sort of pull rank and say, well, I come from two cultures and I see the similarities, right? Yeah. I can tell you that there are differences. And when we go back to patterns, the differences that I see in my multiple worlds, actually, because it isn't even just Britain and Sierra Leone. You know, I mean, I spent 30 years in London. I'm married to an Englishman. My younger brother lives in Hong Kong and is married to a Chinese woman. My sister is married to a West Indian British man, and my brother was married to an Iranian woman and is now married to a Danish woman, and I have an half Iranian niece. So, you know, I've grown up with multiple influences. But what I will say, when we see difference, I think what we're looking at are really patterns of thinking. That's what I see. So if I look at my Sierra Leone family, one big difference, for example, is polygamy. My Sierra Leonean grandfather had 16 wives, and what you see there are different. As people try to adapt to their environment, or they adapt to their circumstances, you see sort of different patterns of thinking emerging. And those, I think, are the differences. But I don't think that those differences are fundamental. I think they are differences created by a set of conditions, which makes it completely possible, therefore, to imagine oneself into those conditions. I mean, it's interesting what you say, you know, that one can be accused of flattening things out. In 2013, I published a book set in Croatia, The Hired Man. Yeah. My main character was a man, a white man, right? I wrote in the first person, in the I, and I set it all in Croatia. Now, there was general astonishment that this was possible, which I think was a little shallow in it, you know, a little superficial, because it was all about, oh my goodness, a black woman has done this, whereas white men appear to have been doing it for ages without anybody commenting. And the publishers and I kind of knew this was going to come. But I think what's really interesting about it is that I always saw the similarities in the conditions of those countries, because I was writing about civil conflict. And I was writing about, to me, I was writing about two contemporaneous wars. They'd taken place at the same time. The countries were actually geographically extremely similar. Same size population, rural population. Most of the economy is based on much the same thing, agriculture and a bit of tourism. Very traditional societies, but they had this really, really major thing in common, which is they were both societies that had gone through 25 years of dictatorship, followed by a rapid economic downturn, followed by a civil war. Now, I've toured Croatia with that book I've toured parts of the forum. I've been to Sarajevo as well and talked about it, you know. So I've been invited to Kosovo. Unfortunately, I couldn't go, but I've been to all these places and talked about it. Nobody there is saying you can't do this.
Yeah.
In fact, really interestingly, not only were they interested to talk about the similarities, not only were they fascinated by all of this, that there are political similarities and some differences, but we can talk about that another time. But they were really interested to pinpoint what are the historic and political similarities, and when things are different, why are they different? And that isn't to do with geography. But the other thing was that it was said to me several times, only you could do this. Only you could write that book. And I said, why? And they said, because whoever wrote it from here would be seen as being partisan on one side or the other. So it's the fact that somebody from the outside wrote it that gave the book a different kind of authority. So, you know, these conversations are being had very much in the United States, but they're not necessarily being had elsewhere.
That's interesting.
But can I ask you, because there's, you know, I'm always curious as well as, you know, what stories make other people what. So there's an idea, Maureen, which is called narrative identity. And this is something to me that writers do instinctively, understand that people are built of stories. But psychologists now call it narrative identity, and they've begun to really identify how it operates. So if I could give you a really, and the audience, a really sort of simple introduction to narrative identity, it goes like this. The sort of first layer are the story, probably the stories your family tell you, right? When you grow up, fairy stories and things like that, little Grimm's. I mean, I was given Grimm's fairy stories. And then there's a terrible book called The Book of Nonsense by Edward Lear, which was just full of children having their thumbs cut off for sucking them. But anyway, all the stories, and then there'll be family stories, right? About, you know, I don't know, your parents, your grandparents, where you grew up, folklore, and all these kinds of things, but family stories. And then it goes on to the books you read, the kinds of TV series you grow up with. And then it goes, and then you get into the realm of choice, what you choose to read. But also, of course, master narratives, great legends, history books, all of these things. And around about the age of 18 or 19, and this is where the psychologists come in, around about the age of 18 or 19, you begin to distill those stories, accept some, reject some, reframe them, right? And what you come out with after that moment of critical analysis is what we call your narrative identity. Mm-hmm. So thinking about that, what would your narrative identity be made of? What are the layers of it?
Yeah, well, that's, you know, I did write a literary memoir called Leave Me Alone, I'm Reading. And, and I think I wasn't as self-conscious about the project I was undertaking as to say, oh, I'm excavating my narrative identity. But no. that is really what I did. I think my narrative identity derives from two things. One, absolutely those stories, those earliest stories. And if you look at the second layer beyond family, I'm a Catholic schoolgirl of a certain vintage. So when I was going to elementary school, we read a lot of martyr stories, and not just Catholic martyrs who became saints, but secular martyr stories about Dr. Tom Dooley, who operated in Southeast Asia in the 1950s and died early of cancer and didn't complain about it. The secular martyrs always had some terrible burden and didn't complain about it, sucked it up, were self-deprecating, didn't make a big fuss. Terry Eagleton, the British literary critic who I admire, he wrote a memoir years ago and he nailed it. He said he came from a similar background to mine, Irish Catholic, working class. He said his family's ambition in life was that when they died, they would have a tombstone over the family plot that read, "We were no trouble." That was the ethos, you know, be quiet, suck it up. So I
Yeah.
think that's and that has affected the kind of literature I think I like. I mean, I realized in thinking back over those stories that I don't like books that call too much attention to their style, that are too impressed with their own literary greatness. I still have trouble, like with, say, Henry James. I find him off-putting because he's too invested in the acrobatics of his sentence structure. So that's something. And then I think the other thing that, honestly, and maybe you can speak to this as well, that really had a huge influence on me was the cityscape growing up. I grew up in Long Island City, which meant that I had that Gatsby-like vista of Manhattan in front of me every day. And there's that beautiful scene in Gatsby where Nick and Gatsby are going over the 59th Street Bridge. And Nick says, the city scene from the Queensboro Bridge is always the city scene for the first time. And he goes on talking about this gorgeousness of that cityscape circa 1925 or so. I mean, I really did have that A Tree Grows in Brooklyn childhood, where you went up on the roof of your apartment building to get air in the summer and saw the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building. I think that did have an effect of, you know, there's a wider world over there, right over there, and you can reach for it, and you can try for it. And that is, you know, I mean, that's a vista that a lot of New York writers who grew up in the outer boroughs have talked about, that reaching for something else.
Yeah, I think there's a I suppose a game, what would you call it, a kind of interaction I do sometimes with my students, which is also about identity. And which a psychologist, I'm sort of fascinated by psychologists and psychology because it crosses over so much with writing to me. I mean, I think writers are natural psychologists. It's if we've pursued another discipline, that would probably be it, or at least if I did. Well, actually, I always want to be everything. I want to be a vet as well, and all kind of wildlife biologists and all sorts of things. But I am completely fascinated by psychology. And one of the things a psychologist taught me was how to sort of figure out who you are, and it was about identity. And he said, I'm going to ask you 10 questions. Now, actually, if you're a participant, do this. If you're listening, do this in your head, right? You can't shout out, you have to do it in your head. He said, I'm going to ask you 10 questions, and I want you to answer each question spontaneously, as fast as you can, and you may not repeat yourself, right? So we started, and he said, who are you? Then he said, next question, who are you? And he said, next question, who are you? Next question, who are you? Next question, who are you? Right, so you have to keep on finding these answers. And I can remember that I answered, and I've done it with my students. I answered, I'm my father's daughter first. Now, I was writing a memoir about my father, so that was very uppermost in my mind. But, you know, when we talk about stories, my father's story had a very profound effect on me. He was somebody who endeavored and tried to change something. And it didn't succeed in his lifetime, but I think had a great impact on the way things changed in the country later on. But then I said, I'm a writer. It was what I did that was the next most important thing. And my third thing was, I said, I'm a Londoner, which surprised even me because I wouldn't necessarily have thought of that. But by that time, I'd been living in London for 30 years. And you're a New Yorker, and it's quite fascinating that actually every time I've done this with my students, they mention place really very rarely, actually. They don't say I'm Pakistani or Chinese or American. They actually don't reference their ethnicity either. They don't say I'm Black or I'm Asian or American or whatever. they very often, family comes very high, religion comes high, sexuality comes high, especially for LGBTQA kids. But when they do talk about place, it's always a city, right?
Yeah.
They'll say, I'm from Mumbai,
Yeah.
I'm from Calcutta, I'm from Lagos,
Right.
I'm from, I don't know, Cape Town or Nairobi or London or Paris.
Mhm.
And so that what we're seeing now is that locality is more important than nationality when people are thinking about identity.
Mm.
So I do think of myself as a Londoner, as well as all the other things that I am. I am all these other things, but I'm also a Londoner. And I can see that, you know, when I go to New York and I meet New Yorkers, whether they are born New Yorkers or chosen New Yorkers, right? Because people choose New York, and I've got a couple of friends who chose New York. And it's like, we are going to live here, we're going to be New Yorkers now, really recognize the commitment to the city and the love of the city, which I find very rarely in other cities. I find it in London, but I find it very rarely in other cities, that so much of the person is defined by the relationship with the city.
Yeah. I was in New York. I think I told you last week I was going to New York, first time since the pandemic, and I visited last week. And I did a lot of things, but the thing I enjoyed most was walking. And you write about walking.
Or not walking.
Or not, yeah, but you also write about the pitfalls of walking, about being a woman and what that's like.
The challenges, yeah, it's difficult.
Challenges, yeah, better word than pitfalls. But yeah, and also you write about walking through Northern Virginia landscapes where that almost seems sometimes at certain parts of the day primeval. The foxes are taking over or whatever.
The deer. I mean, it's very, very interesting. So Happiness, the novel that I most recently published, was called A London Novel, which actually wasn't really what I was thinking of when I wrote it. But what I was thinking of was the way in which cities are layered. You know, that there are different populations in a city, and they occupy different power. They have a different sort of status in terms of power structure of the city, and the different groups can be generational. Old people often struggle in cities, and there are parts of London. There are parts of London you will not see an old person or a child. I mean, if you go to the City of London, which is the commercial part of it, you will never see a child. I asked somebody, when did you last see a child in the city? They went, wow, I've never seen a child in the city, or an old person. It's not kind to the elderly. I think New York is kinder to the elderly. I see quite a lot of elderly people in New York.
Yeah.
But so it might be age, it might be immigration status. You know, that you are either an immigrant, or you are not legally in the country, or you are a native. It might be that you're a Londoner or not a Londoner, right? Because Londoners, you know, born Londoners really do, you know, feel an ownership on the city. On the other hand, it is a city that can be very welcoming to people who wish to become Londoners. But there's also the animal population of a city and the human population of a city. And so it's quite fascinating what people look at when they go through a city. Yeah. So I remember when that book was published, somebody said to me, some of the critics wrote, "Sees the people most of us don't notice." And I thought, well, who's us? Because you know, I wrote a lot about the kinds of people who, the doorman, hotel doorman, right, who, and street cleaners. But I really noticed hotel doormen, partly because I stay in a lot of hotels, but partly because so many of them are West African. Mm-hmm. And I first started noticing them in Washington, DC and in Atlanta, because a lot of the doormen are Sierra Leonean, and they would recognize my name, and so would the staff in the hotel. So when I was on tour, I would find that hotel staff would extend all these little courtesies to me because they realized I was soloing, and they'd start saying, they would get me a taxi, or get a nephew to drive me to the airport, or keep the restaurant open for me at night if I came back after my talk so I could get something. So there was this kind of exchange that was going on with, based on the fact that we had this connection. But I also very much notice animals in the city, is particularly wildlife. I've always been really fascinated by the way wildlife continues to survive in the city. But now, if you ask another person, you ask my husband, for example, what he sees when he walks through a city: architecture. Right? He sees the, he's a designer, right? And he's a very, very, very geospatial way of thinking. So, and I know this does sound like gender stereotyping, but to that extent, we do fulfill that. I have no interest in buildings, but that's really what he sees, the layout of a building, and is, and the layout of a city, and he can cross and recross a city very easily. He can find his way almost everywhere all the time, and he sort of fundamentally understands how cities are arranged geographically in ways that I don't understand. So, I'm not that interested in, but so people look at very, very different things, and so happiness was really about a city, I guess, through my own particular lens, which was animals, but other kinds of people.
Happiness also, when I first read it, made me think of a quote by the great New York journalist, writer Pete Hamill, who I revere. And one of the things Hamill said about New York was that as a city, it offers the opportunity for passing encounters with people who are not you. And happiness dramatizes that kind of encounter. I mean, more than a passing encounter, but two people come together partly because of the foxes that are being traced in the novel. But I think it may be romantic, but those of us who love cities, I think, love that about cities, that kind of close proximity to that may not be more than just passing, but people who are not you.
I think that's right. And I mean, New York in a way is quite European in that sense, because it relies on people using their feet to get around so much. Right. Unlike Los Angeles, or but even in I live in Falls Church, but the way that public transport is in the DC area means that we use our cars a lot. Unless you're right in the middle, you tend to use your car a lot. But New Yorkers, all were very, very sensible footwear, as do Londoners. Right. They walk absolutely everywhere, and it is being on the streets that brings about those encounters, and I think brings about a much greater harmony between people, because one does
you have to share the space.
So, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about a few other kinds of things in the time we have left before we start talking with our unknown audience here, because you wear a lot of different hats, and as do I. You run the Lannan Center, you sit on literary prize committees, you write, you recorded the audiobook for the window seat. What do you want to talk about? I want to hear about all of that.
Well, should we talk about audiobooks? Because I'm a great fan of audiobooks, and also because I get asked about the process quite a lot of having one's books turned into audiobooks. And you're a radio broadcaster, so you have an understanding of how audio works and what the requirements of it are. So I'm often asked, for example, do you read your? I mean, I used to be a broadcaster, so I did TV and later radio, but I'm often asked, do you read your own audiobooks? And I say, well, no. oh, you should say people you have a good speaking voice. And I say, yes, but my books are, sometimes there's a male character or multiple characters. But, and listeners get confused or misled, I suppose, confused or misled if a woman narrates a book with a male main character, and vice versa, right? If a man narrates a book, they want that kind of voice character harmony. So I don't. But the other thing I have said is audio really requires, I think actors do it best, and audio has changed so much over the last 20 years. I mean, it really has entered its own. And I listen to a lot of audio, actually, just because I get bored all the time if I don't have something. I love story. And I would rather listen to an audiobook when I'm driving than I would listen to music most of the time. And especially when I'm cooking, I like to listen to an audio. But anyway, it's really interesting, the exponential rise of audio to me. And but I'm a great fan of actors reading audio, because what I say is, yes, we can all read it, but can we perform it? Mm-hmm. Right, all the different accents that come up and the different voices. And I sometimes tell a story that my book, The Memory of Love, was my book, The Memory of Love, when it was turned into an audio, the audio company sent me a little clip of the actor and say, how do you feel about that? And I said, well, he's good, but his accent is not quite right. It's too heavy for this particular character. It's too strongly West African. I said, this man, Elias Cole, he's a Creole. And the actor was Ghanaian, so knew a little bit, I think, about what I was talking about. But then I got a message saying he'd like to give you a call. So when I picked up the phone, the actor was in character, right, spoke to me as Elias Cole. Mm-hmm. And he said, is this right? Is this more how he speaks? So I said, well, that's much closer. But the thing is, he spent 10 years in Britain. And so, and that affected his accent. And then the actor changed it in that moment and said, so it's more like this. Yeah, he sounds more like this. Yeah. And, I mean, that is not something I can do. I've listened to some of my audio. In fact, actually, if anyone here is a Bridgerton fan, my other books are read by Lady Danbury, aka Joa Ando. And she and I would work in quite work very closely over pronunciations. And so every evening she sends me, when she's recording, she sends me a whole list of pronunciations for books that are set particularly in Sierra Leone or the Croatian ones. I actually, sometimes with the Croatian ones, I then had to call a Croatian friend and say, can you check we've got this right? But I would then record them all into my phone, send her the audio, and then the next day she would record it. And it's also interesting, I recorded The Window Seat because it was essays and it was my voice. And so I recorded The Window Seat. But even though I was a professional broadcaster, I was still, and they were my words, and I wrote it, I was still stumbling a lot and doing it in far more takes than I know a professional actor would do. So I'm all hats off to professional actors in audio. Yeah. I think they're doing us all a favor. Are you an audio fan, Maureen?
I recorded my 2 books and it's exhausting. I mean,
it is.
I'm used to, of course, recording Fresh Air, which is 7-8 minutes, and we do 2 takes. But to do hour after hour, to try to keep your voice strong and yet relaxed, it's challenging. It's
I chose to do mine in half days.
Oh, okay.
I came in for 3 or 4 hours, 3 hours every morning, because just to do a 6-hour stunt. So anyway, I'm really, I'm amazed. I'm impressed that you did it in.
I don't think I had a choice. I don't think they gave me a choice. It was like, let's get this done. But before I recorded, I found this amazing story about Orson Welles recording Mel.
Oh, Maureen's frozen for me. Is she frozen for anybody else?
She does seem to be frozen. Let's see if she pops back in for a moment.
Well, I suppose I should fill the time while we wait. I don't know if she's going to tell the Orson Welles story about recording War of the Worlds. Maureen, you frozen.
Oh, I froze.
Were you
I'm
going to
sorry.
tell us about War of the
Oh,
Worlds?
forget it. We need to take questions from the
Okay.
audience. Yes, I'm sorry.
Go ahead and finish it, Maureen, and then we'll jump into questions.
Oh, I just, I just recorded 24 lectures on banned and burned books that I wrote over the last year. And this is for one of those great courses series. And before I was recording those 24 lectures in 1 week, I read this anecdote about Orson Welles working for Mel Brooks on one of his films. And Welles was coming in and he was supposed to work for an entire week recording the voiceover for the film, the comedy that Mel Brooks did about the Bible. And Welles did the entire film in 5 hours flawlessly. Took the check from Mel Brooks and got on a plane back to London. And, I didn't need to read that anecdote right before I was recording, because after a while I'm stumbling over every third sentence, but not all of us can be Orson Welles. So that was the anecdote.
Oh, great. Thank you very much indeed. And
Yes.
now I guess we should go to questions.
Yes.
If anybody else wants to know any more about recording audio.
That was a turn I didn't think we were to go to today for the conversation. So thank you. It's an element of writing that I think people don't think of as much, but it's becoming more and more prevalent. So we've had a few questions come in. This is kind of a general one that I think, obviously from the title of the event about storytelling. What advice do you have for those of us watching who may have a story that they want to tell? How do they start? How do they find inspiration, etc.? I know everyone's writing process is different, but maybe we'd love to hear a little bit more about both of yours.
Maureen, would you like to go first?
Well, I'll go first, and I'll lower the tone of this discussion. I think the best writing advice is ass in chair. I think you show up every day. When I was writing my book on Fitzgerald and the Great Gatsby, I had a very tight deadline and I had to show up every day. And some days, and I always, would write. Sometimes it wasn't very good. And I would always entitle whatever I wrote and send it to myself because I was so paranoid about losing drafts. And some days I would just write, well, at least you showed up. And really that was it. I mean, it's just that I showed up and I wrote something. But for me, the momentum of showing up every day, eventually something happens. So that's my very practical advice.
I agree with that. Another way of putting it is don't get it right, get it written.
Yes.
Interestingly, Maureen, you and I was a journalist for 10 years, which, I became a journalist because I thought it was a way of writing and being paid at the same time, but wasn't really necessarily a vocation, although I found many aspects of that work fascinating. But I have learned to set my own deadlines and meet them, right? And I've also learned that I can set a word count and say, right, in fact, I was talking to somebody yesterday who said, how do you do it? And I said, nonfiction, 1,000 words a day. So long as I've got the time and I'm not, on a good day, 1,000 words. And actually, believe me, I could do more when it's nonfiction, but it has to be 1,000 words a day. Fiction, I lower it quite a lot because fiction requires such a lot of work from the imagination and also, style and language. But I tell myself, you're staying here really till you got those 1,000 words written. Right. Every day, and sometimes it gets rewritten, sometimes parts of it get crossed out, but if it isn't on paper, you don't have everything. But the other thing I say is, try to, instead of thinking that you're writing a book, just say, I'm writing a paragraph. Mm-hmm. I'm writing 2 paragraphs. I'm writing this scene. Right? I'm writing this exchange. It's when you go into something thinking that you've got a mountain to climb that it becomes overwhelming. You just say, today I am going to write the moment when I adopted the dog that I fell in love with at, the last dogs. This is the last thing I did most recently is adopt a dog. But, I'm just going to write about that, or I'm just going to write about my 5th birthday party and leave it at that, and just try not to make the whole thing too big.
Yeah. I think it's also encouraging to look at first, second, third drafts of great works of literature. I mean, and to see, I'm teaching my Fitzgerald course right now. So we're looking at parts of Gatsby that were crossed out and, taped together. And oh my God, thank God he didn't go with that draft, just that it is such a process. It's.
Oh, I think there was a journal that tried to get a whole bunch of us writers to give our first drafts. I don't know whether they got anywhere. I was just too humiliated by the idea that anyone would read my
Yeah.
But yeah.
A little bit related specifically to your comment about the word count for fiction versus nonfiction. We did get a comment / question from an audience member. I'm going to read it verbatim. I'm an Iranian immigrant and can identify with so much you've talked about. I was a lawyer for most of my career and recently started writing essays. I've written 2 pieces recently about the American immigrant experience, and both went viral. People seem to be hungry to connect to the stories of belonging and identity. How different is your process writing between a novel versus writing creative nonfiction, if at all?
Pretty different. But let me just say 2 things. One is I started out as a lawyer because I came from a kind of good African family that wanted us to be lawyers and doctors. But the second thing is actually, because we always get asked for reading recommendations. Yeah. And next week at the Lannan Centre, our guest is Leila Lalami, who has written Conditional Citizens, which is an essay collection about identity and belonging and being a Muslim in America. And you're right, there is a hunger for that kind of material. I think the difference is, and it was actually put to me by another writer, Gillian Slovo, and she said, when you write nonfiction, you know what your story is, but when you write fiction, you don't know what your story is. You don't always know what your story is. So with fiction, for me, there's a lot more feeling in the dark and a lot more direction can change. When I write nonfiction, I really know what it is I'm trying to say. I've just got to find the way to say it, right? And sometimes that can take me a while. Sometimes I can sit there looking for, I know what it is that's bothering me. And actually fiction and nonfiction begin in the same way. They begin with a question that's really bothering me, something that will not let me rest and that I keep wanting the answer to. So I say they start in the same way. But what I call nonfiction is the found story, is that sometimes you just stumble on and you think, oh, this is it. So my essay collection, writing about cities, to go back to Maureen's point, but also writing about animals in the city, a great fascination of mine. It was meeting a vet who worked in Sierra Leone, and he's the only vet in Freetown, and he has an absolute passion for street dogs, as do I. And I was able to write this by spending a week with him, able to write this sort of multi-layered piece about cities and about human-animal interaction and the difference between the way animals were seen in different parts of the world and the lens that I was able to bring to that. So I often think that nonfiction is the found story, but not all my stories work around a person. Sometimes they work around themes, or a question or a particular experience, but I can find the elements of it, and I'm finding them around me, and I'm finding them in my life, and they are a work of nonfiction is composed of sort of 3 things. It's composed of scene and summary, but it's also composed of the idea of musing, that you can let yourself, you, the writer, are allowed into it in order to talk to the reader and say what it is you're thinking about, in a way that you can't without a device anyway, the device of a narrator with fiction. I mean, I at the moment I'm going through a real world creative nonfiction phase of reading it a lot and writing creative nonfiction. I think going back to the question Maureen asked me earlier on about, you know, writing outside one's own experiencing and flattening and people being criticized for trying to write the other. I think that the policing of the imagination in the last few years has been very, very disappointing. Direction for fiction to take in, and I think that what's happening is a lot of writers are actually turning to creative nonfiction, and one is seeing this real burgeoning of new forms of creative nonfiction, which are quite fascinating. So that's a silver lining. We'll take it. But
these are kind of semi-aligned in this, but one question is specifically about what writers do you enjoy who write in genres that you currently do not? And then if there was a book that either of you would read over and over and over again, like what's the one you always kind of pick up when you're in a specific mood or looking for some inspiration?
Well, obviously The Great Gatsby for me, but I will give a current recommendation. And again, Aminata and I have talked about this writer a little bit. I just finished reading and reviewing Claire Keegan's novella, Foster. And she is just an astonishing Irish writer who is spare in her style. And kind of like Hemingway's Iceberg Theory, there are just fathoms beneath every one of her sentences. Her writing just knocks me out. So I recommend her.
I'm going to recommend, I mean, I could recommend various because I've got thumbed copies of, you know, for example, Michael Ondaatje, whose writing I love. But this time I'm going to recommend Javier Marias for the reason that he died in September, and he's one of Spain's greatest writers. And in the multi-layering of the stories that make one, I studied French and Spanish literature when I was at school before I was forced down the gangplank of becoming a lawyer. But I studied French and Spanish literature, and I have a great love of Spanish literature. And Javier Marias, A Heart So White, I think is one of the most beautiful books I've ever read. Just beautiful in language and beautiful in style and form, or almost formlessness, really. I do love his writing, and I often go to A Heart So White. At the moment, my favorite book of the last couple of years has been a book called Island of Abandonment, which is environmental, I think it's now called eco-criticism or something. I don't know, there's so many different ways of branding things. I mean, to me, she's an environmental writer. And Island of Abandonment by Cal Flynn, a Scottish writer. And the book is, Cal Flynn goes to different parts of the world which humans have abandoned, be it somewhere like Chernobyl for very obvious reasons, or be it somewhere like Detroit because the city has sort of fallen into economic decline. But she goes to places where humans are no longer, particularly, very much in evidence, and she writes about the changes to the environmental structures of those places. And one of the most fascinating is when she goes to Ypres in France, which is where all the mustard gas and the poisonous gases after, or the chemicals that made the poisonous gases after the First World War were dumped. And she goes into all these areas which have been for decades closed off, and looks at how the vegetation and the animals have actually adapted to this highly contaminated landscape, which from the series Chernobyl we now know has also happened in Chernobyl, that whatever the conditions, life goes on, which is both fascinating I guess one can draw hope from it. I do. Not much hope for humankind, because I don't think we can adapt to poisonous landscapes, but certainly for the natural world. But it's a fascinating direction to go in. And she's also just a consummate writer. I mean, some of her work, some of her language is absolutely beautiful. Her use of language is absolutely gorgeous. So Cal Flynn, Islands of Abandonment, and A Heart So White by Javier Marias.
Wonderful. Thank you. We have two more questions. I think we'll probably have time for both. One is a little bit, leaning on the fact that both of you are, work here at Georgetown and having the opportunity to work with Georgetown students or young writers as they explore literature and their own narratives. What is that like as you balance your own careers or paths as writers, but then having the opportunity to work with young writers and students at Georgetown?
It's usually, for me, very uplifting, in that I often teach books that I love and that I reread every other year or so. And I know it sounds sentimental and sappy and expected, but I learn a lot from my students. They come at these texts from different angles, and some of them are excellent close readers, and they open up different just avenues, different ways of thinking about texts that I've, somehow thought that I've mastered, but learned, of course, that I haven't. I also like working with students on their writing, and at the same time, I always hear that Yeats line in my head, tread softly because you tread on my dreams. I feel like I have to sort of pull back a little bit on my critic self when I'm working with students, because working with their writing is not the same as looking at a published piece of work that I'm coming at as a critic.
I think what I find fascinating about working with students at Georgetown is, and actually this goes back to a part of a question I realized I didn't answer, which was what work do we like of writers who write in a genre different from our own. And actually, I tend to read a lot of people who write within my genre, because I'm always interested in what other people are doing and how they're doing it. But I was moved to read more speculative fiction by working with Georgetown writers, because this younger generation, as we see from the offerings on television, work in the realm of fantasy and speculative fiction and Afro-Judaism and Afrofuturism, all of these areas that are completely new to me. And one of the things I had to do was I had to watch the whole of Game of Thrones just so I got the references, because people kept throwing around references like the Red Wedding, and I had no idea what they were talking about. So I had to go and do that. But they do work in areas that are completely new to me, and I have to get my whole mind around the idea of world building. One world builds in fiction, but not the way you world build in speculative fiction. I had a student recently who he was world building. He was writing something which one would call, historical fantasy, I think he called it. But he was an African-American student, and he was studying Japanese as well. And there was a strong influence there of manga, I think, is the only form I know anything about, but there are other Japanese forms of very strong influences, and to sort of see these two worlds come together to create another world was really quite fascinating. So to answer that question about books outside one genre, I never read speculative fiction. I couldn't really sort of get into it, but I picked up Octavia Butler's Kin, and I was really blown away by that book. So that would be my recommendation for books outside my genre that I have recently read.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both. We're right at 1 p.m. I want to give you, if either of you have any final parting thoughts, I am happy to turn it over to you, but otherwise we can close out. And thanks everyone for joining us.
Oh, I just want to say thanks very much. It was a great conversation. Thanks, Maureen. Thank you, Stephanie. And, thanks to the advancement webinars. It was really good fun way to spend the lunch hour.
Yes, thanks everyone, especially Aminata. Bye.
Wonderful. Thank you everyone for joining us. And we hope you enjoyed the discussion. Please look out for a follow-up email with more information of upcoming events. And as we talked about, the recording of this session. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.